There we go. Hey everyone, I'm here with Adam McHugh. Adam is a sommelier and wine tour guide, a former PCUSA pastor and hospice chaplain, and the author of Blood from a Stone, a memoir of how wine brought me back from the dead. Hi Adam, how you doing?
Hey Marcus, how's it going?
Good. I'm so glad to have you here and to have this conversation that we're going to have. Adam, tell us just kind of briefly what you do.
So I live in a place called the San Ynez Valley, which is about 2.5 hours north of LA, depending on traffic, just about a half hour north of Santa Barbara. I work in the wine industry here. This is a big wine country. And what I do is I lead wine tours predominantly out of Santa Barbara. I work with a company down there that we pick up guests on private tours, bring them up to the San Ynez Valley over the mountains and show them a day of wine education, take them to 3 different stops and give them a good lunch and a good picnic lunch and do just a lot of talking about the history, the geography, the wine of this area. And I'm also a sommelier, which is just a professional wine educator. Essentially, I've worked at a number of wineries up here. I also, one of my first jobs was at the wine department at Whole Foods in Pasadena. And so I've worked in various capacities doing a lot of wine education, talking not only about wine, but a lot about dirt and farming and things like that.
Yeah. Fascinating. And I learned a lot about that reading your book, which I'm excited to we'll talk some more about. Your book, but really kind of your life. But we'll come to that. I do want to ask you one quick get to know you question. And that's just what book are you reading right now?
I'm reading I'm a total history dork. With anyone that reads my book is going to discover how much I love the history of wine as much as wine itself. So I'm reading a book
Hmm.
called Powers and Thrones, which is this 600-page book on the history of the Middle Ages. Right now, I read it like
Wow.
5 or 8 pages a day. I think I've been reading it since last summer, and I'm due to
Wow.
finish it like in March or April. So I feel like
That's
I went
great.
to Princeton School of Theology, and I feel like we kind of
Uh-huh.
stopped at about the 325 or about the Council of Nicaea in church history, and then just pretty much took a
Okay.
couple weeks to go through 1,000 years, and then got to the Reformation. And I feel like I have a big gap
Wow.
in my historical knowledge of the Middle Ages, so I'm
Ah,
trying to catch up a little bit with that.
that's great. That's awesome. I love it. Yeah, I can see the whole history thing in terms of the way you talk about your experience in the book, and I feel like I learned a lot about wine and wine history, and even about Southern California geography. And I'm like, oh, that's why Oxnard is due west of Pasadena, not north, which is what it feels like, right?
Totally, totally.
Yeah. Anyway, so why don't you just sort of tell us, just tell us your story, and then we'll go from there. Yeah.
Yeah. So I got ordained as a PCUSA pastor, I guess about 15 years ago after going to Princeton Seminary. And I always wanted to be an academic, though I went to grad school with the intention of getting a PhD in teaching New Testament or ancient languages. I wasn't totally sure. Kind of burned out of academia fairly quickly into my years in seminary. Discovered it wasn't as romantic as I thought it was going to be. I didn't get to wear
Mm,
jackets with leather patches on it. There was none of
yeah.
that, which was disappointing. And so, to get ordained in the PCUSA, I had to do what's called CPE, Clinical Pastoral Education, which I'm
Mhm.
sure will be familiar to a lot of your listeners. And I ended up doing it at St. Joe's in the city of Orange, California, back in, I think that was like 2002, thereabouts. And that's what opened up the world of chaplaincy to me. I had never considered that. I always wanted to be a teacher or an academic or a scholar, or if I was going to be a pastor, more of a preaching pastor. But that experience was so transformative and so impactful for me that it did open up the possibility of chaplaincy. And
Mm,
a few years later, I did work as a college minister at the Claremont colleges for several years. But a few years later, a position opened up with a hospice chaplain in the San Gabriel Valley through Vitas Hospice. And I ended up taking that job and did that for several years. So that was kind of the prelude. That's why the subtitle of my book is a memoir of how wine brought me back from the dead, because my work was working with the dying, and often doing what were called death visits. When a patient would die on our service, I would be
Mm.
called to go and be
Yeah.
with the family and try to provide some
Yeah.
teaspoon of comfort for them. So
Yeah.
that was my backdrop before I got into wine, and moved a couple hours north to the San Ynez Valley. And essentially, what
Mhm.
happened was this valley, the San Ynez Valley, which is just drenched with wine and just these beautiful bucolic hillsides, became my retreat, my escape from
Mhm.
my work as a hospice minister. I would come up here as often as I
Yeah.
could to just breathe in this air, take in these landscapes, taste these wines, eat the farm to table food around here. And I had this fantasy of one day giving it all up and disappearing
Mm.
into wine country. And about 10 years ago, through a number of different circumstances, I did. So that's how I got to this
Yeah.
valley and into the wine industry.
Yeah. Well, I wanna hear about those circumstances. What, tell us about, I mean, so you were a hospice chaplain. Why did you stop?
Compassion fatigue is the easy,
Mm.
or I guess the hard answer for that.
Mhm.
Compassion fatigue, again, something that may be familiar to many of your listeners. It feels
Mhm.
like depression, but it's a little bit more circumstantial. And I'm a very introverted person. My first book was called Introverts in the Church, so my temperament is a little bit more sensitive, and I also just don't have the same social and emotional energy that some other pastors
Yeah.
I've met do. And so compassion fatigue hit me frequently and with a lot of power, a lot of force, which is
Mm.
why I needed to be in therapy, but also to find therapeutic
Mm.
settings like the San Ynez Valley.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I did that job, I guess, on and off for about 8 years. I had two different stints. The first one, I was working a more typical schedule of Monday through Friday during the day. But then through the Great Recession hit back in '08, and the only position that was available for me after that was working midnight to 8. So for better,
Yeah.
without any better way of putting it, I was a graveyard shift chaplain on many different levels. And
Mm.
that really took its toll on me. Not only the nature of the job, but just working from midnight to 8, and then trying to have some normal life during the day. And
Yep.
so,
Yep.
those factors combined with compassion fatigue pretty much did me in.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you left. Did you well, uh, tell us about how you left. Like,
Yeah,
I'm thinking about the story you told in the book, and you didn't
yeah.
just quit. You
No, I
kinda
did
quit,
not just
but
quit. It was one of those, I always describe it to people as, it was one of those breakups where you sort of leave the relationship before the relationship actually ends. So I think
Mm.
by the time there was about 6 months to go, I just ceased to really be able to do the job, just emotionally,
Mm. Yeah.
psychically, spiritually. I just no longer had the capacity to do it, but I stayed. I hung in there. It's like
Yeah.
one of those relationships
Yeah.
that's clearly ending or even over, but you
Yeah.
just kind of hang on to it because you don't know what else you're going to do, and you need to make a living.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so essentially, at the end, I was fired, and I was fired in the most interesting way. I'd had
Mm.
a couple of warnings before, a couple of complaints for my service or lack thereof, depending on how
Mhm.
you interpret it. But the last time that it's kind of the third strike for me was when I went to be with a patient who was Catholic. Her friend said, "Hey, can we get a priest in here to come and pray for her?" And I said,
Mhm.
"Absolutely." And from my experience, when you're a Protestant chaplain and when Catholics say we want someone to pray for her, they don't want a Presbyterian minister. They want the priest from the nearby parish.
Mm.
So I left and then called,
Right.
as I often did, to try to get the Catholic priest to come out before this person died. But then the next day,
Mhm.
these people complained to my boss that they'd asked for prayer, and I'd said no, and I drove away, which was not what happened.
Uh,
But in the end,
right.
it was interesting
Right.
because I was basically fired for not acting enough like a pastor.
Oh.
Yeah.
That's rough. Um,
Yes.
and how did that hit you? How did that feel?
I mean, it was the start of a huge personal, professional upheaval. It wasn't the start. It was probably, the third step along that way.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
what I was thankful for was that all of my time in hospice and as a grief counselor and as a chaplain, it really gave me a lens for understanding what was happening for me. And that was the
Hmm.
lens of grief. We talk about grief
Yeah.
when you lose a loved one, or, when you lose something very specific, but there's a real grieving process, I think, that comes along with life transition, with career loss, with job loss, with, the identity upheaval that comes with it. And so
Yeah.
what I saw was that fairly quickly was that I was in a real grieving process. I had trained so hard for so long to
Yeah.
be a pastor, with all the education,
Yeah.
all the meetings, all the tests you had to take, all the
Hmm.
all the times you had to stand up in front of people and give your statement of faith and whatnot, and all of that. And I put so much into it, and so it was a real blow that took me several years to recover, even as I moved
Yeah.
into another industry and started working in other
Yeah.
jobs. So I was thankful
Yeah.
that I had that lens of grief to help me understand identity transition and all that.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a feeling, excuse me. I have a feeling that some of our listeners, at least, probably resonate with some of the things that you're describing, whether they're chaplains or pastors or whatever. But the compassion fatigue, the sort of getting to a place of sort of phoning it in, just kind of going through the motions, doing the basics, and wondering if this is all there is, you know. um, and so, yeah, I'd love to talk about that because, okay, so let me kind of share a little bit from my perspective then, because I resonate with a lot of what you're saying as well. Um, Now, here's what we don't have in common. Actually, I don't like wine. I'm sorry,
Fair enough.
or beer.
Fair enough.
I'm more of a gin and tonic kind of guy. But
Fair enough. Fair enough.
but I appreciated everything I learned about your wine. So that's what we don't have in common, about what you said about wine.
Okay.
That's what we don't have in common. What we do have in common is a similar story of leaving ministry, of transition. So in my case, I was voted out of my church. This is about almost 8 years ago now. Gosh, what year was that? 2017, I think. 2016. Yeah. And it came after a really difficult year. And I kind of get the whole phoning it in thing. Uh, I don't know if that's exactly the right description for what it was like for me, but I was scared. There were things happening. People were saying things, and then it came to this, congregational meeting where they voted me out by a margin of 2 votes. So it wasn't like everyone, but it was enough, right? There was enough doubt about me that had been stirred up in the congregation.
Huh.
And in my case, I ended up going to work for a nonprofit for a couple of years. And that was so good for me. I needed to not be a pastor for a while and maybe forever. I actually didn't think I would ever go back into ministry. And sometimes I envy those that don't. In my case, I did eventually find my way back in, kind of tiptoeing my way back into a small church 2 hours away from where I live. So clear
Wow.
boundaries. There are mountains between us, and I would go out for a couple days a week. But really good people, and that was one of the blessings there. Really good people
Yeah.
who loved me and sort of restored my hope. But before that, I just remember feeling like I had interviewed at a couple of churches, and I didn't get those positions, and then they were in our presbytery, um, and then I would see the pastors who did get those positions, and the feeling that I had was like, oh my gosh, they're throwing themselves into a snake pit, and I felt like this overwhelming relief that wasn't me. So anyway, I just say that to sort of say I get it,
Yeah.
and and I think there are probably other pastors who are kind of in similar situations. So what would you say to them? Like one of the things that I think maybe people feel or wonder is, oh my gosh, if I leave ministry, I'm going to look like a failure,
Yeah.
like I couldn't cut it.
Right.
Like,
Right.
yeah, like Yeah. So how would you respond to that?
Yeah. I remember, I'm not overly involved in too many of the leadership conversations in the church anymore because my life has changed so much. But I remember back, 10, 15 years ago, I would see all these studies that I think Barna put out
Mm,
about how many pastors were leaving ministry, right?
yeah.
Have you ever seen those studies or, the surveys or whatnot about
Hmm.
this percentage of, this number of pastors have left
Yep.
ministry? And it was always interpreted, and the
Hmm.
stats are one thing, but the way it was interpreted, there was always something that kind of bothered me about it, because it was always
Mm,
interpreted as, like you said, like a failure, whether it was a failure of the
hmm.
individual or a failure of the governing body or of the church or of the community, or a
Mm,
little bit of both. It was always interpreted as though this was a real tragedy. And I remember
yep.
thinking, I had a couple of questions that would come up when I read those, and I thought, I wonder if there's going to be a day when they release one of these studies and I'm going to be one of those numbers. If I'm going to
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
one of
Yeah.
those pastors that left. But then my second
Yep.
question was, does it have to be interpreted as a failure, or can
Hmm.
ministry, professional ministry, be like a stop along kind of the pilgrimage route? Can it be,
Yeah.
a stop along the way, and then for whatever reason, individual reasons, like then it sort of no longer functions as the role that it had, and then now it's time for me or whomever to move on. And can that be something that we actually celebrate or just acknowledge as a part of reality? Because even though I certainly had individual failures in terms of like conversations I had with hospice patients, and I also went
Hmm.
through a divorce, and there was a lot of personal
Mm,
upheaval in my life there,
hmm.
though the PCUSA was really good to me throughout all of that. But there were
Mm,
certainly individual failures. But in the end, I always kind of felt like ministry was not the last stop for me, that there was
mm,
probably some other things out there, that there was more
yeah.
for me out there. And so I guess that's my question for everyone, every pastor, everyone who's kind of experiencing a lot of these questions is, are there ways that we can celebrate it, or just acknowledge that we're all on a pilgrimage route, and that journey isn't over
Hmm.
with, and it doesn't necessarily need to stop at professional ministry.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. Um, and I wonder, one of the things that I have found in my experience, and that was my dark night of the soul. In your book, you refer to that as your dark night of the soul, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit too, what that means and how that shapes us. But now I forgot what I was going to say. So let's talk about that. How does talk about how it was? What do you mean by dark night of the soul?
Well, I
I
was
think
having
more of us. I was going to say I think more of us experience it than maybe we let on.
Yeah.
But tell us about that experience of a dark night of the soul.
I have a chapter in the book called The Dark Night of the Soul, but I was playing with words there because
Mm,
that was when I was
mm,
working midnight to 8 as a
yeah,
hospice
yeah.
chaplain on call. And my entire like professional existence was, I would have a beep, like a 1995 beeper next to me, whether I tried to sleep or just stayed awake at home in the middle of the night. And when someone in our service died and the nurse couldn't get there, then it would go off, and then I would have to call in and then go out and be with the family that had just seen a loved one die
Yeah.
while we waited for the mortuary, and there were a few things to do. So it was literally a dark night. And
Yeah,
just
yeah, yeah.
all of the confusion that comes along with like having the moon be the brightest light in the sky while you're awake,
Yeah, yeah.
and just
Yeah.
the strange inversion that happens when you're awake during the sleeping
Yeah.
hours. And then
Yeah.
of course I was describing the end of my ministry, my professional ministry, as
Yeah.
well, which I knew actually was coming a long time in advance. And I never even intended on getting back into hospice, just like you didn't intend on getting back into church ministry. I'd had a break in
Mhm.
between while I was writing a book, and I never thought I would get back there. But then when I did, for mostly financial reasons, I had to go back to that midnight to 8 shift. And
Yeah.
so I knew that there was something ending within me. I didn't know how long it was
Yeah.
going to take, but in a
Yeah.
lot of ways, I think that was when the grieving process was just
Yeah.
starting, when
Yeah.
I was thinking about, leaving and what's going to come next. And that
Yeah.
went on for a couple of years.
Yeah. Was it you talked about identity a little bit already, but was there a sense of it, how can I stop this because who am I without this? Was there any of that?
Absolutely. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, it had been 15 years that I'd been training in a lot of ways to be in the situation that I was in when go back to
Yeah.
seminary, even kind of thinking about going to seminary. And there really is a way in which I especially think, pastor becomes so intrinsic to a lot of people's identities that you even start to kind of you identify yourself as a minister, and it's very difficult as much as we want to keep those boundaries there when that's how people view you both on and off the clock as a minister. You very much start to identify yourself with it as well, and so losing that felt like I was losing myself in the process. And you
Yeah.
even kind of
Yeah.
start to wonder, am I losing my faith in the process? Because so much of your
Mm.
faith has been expressed in this very public way, right?
Yeah.
Where
Yeah.
all of a, like I'm the sort of official representative of religion wherever I
Yeah.
go.
Yeah.
And when you lose that role, you start to wonder, is my faith going too? And so
Yeah.
there was a big rebuilding process that I had to
Yeah.
go through, or not rebuilding, just as much as
Yeah.
learning to identify what is the kernel of my faith that's
Yeah.
always been there, that little spark that's still burning.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, and for me, one of the helpful things was, I kind of learned the concept through my own dark night of the true self, right? True self, false self. I don't know if that's something that you've given thought to, but I'm curious, in what way did you find your true self, so to speak?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's a good question. And I wrestled with that as well. And in some ways, false self, is maybe not the best term because it's really just kind
Mm,
of talking about sort of how we present ourselves to
yes. Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
But at the same time, what I really wanted to come to terms with was this whole Reverend Adam McHugh thing just like a sham? Like, was the whole thing just like some artificial title and it never really was who I was? Or again, was this a stop along the pilgrimage journey for me? And
Mm,
in the end, and I
yeah.
wrestled with it, and let's not pretend it doesn't take a long time to sort out all of these different personal and professional questions. But in
Yeah.
the end, I felt like this wasn't artificial. This was an expression of who I was
Mm,
at the time,
mm-hmm.
but
Mm-hmm.
who I was changing and had changed, and it was like I needed to change my clothes at that point. But
Yeah. Yeah.
what was underneath was still me, and my faith was real,
Yes.
that my
Yeah.
identity was real, and that in a lot of ways I felt like I was actually sort of progressing, not necessarily
Yeah.
regressing out of it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. And so, how would you say that you were you then and you are you now? In other words, like, if you're still the same person, which you are, right?
Yeah.
What is the common thing between ministry and chaplain and wine sommelier?
I mean, the joke that I always make, that just to sort of disarm people, when I tell people, when I've worked at wineries, and they'll say, "So how long have you been here, and how did you get here?" And I'll tell them just briefly my story. I used to be a hospice chaplain in Pasadena, and now I'm a sommelier in the San Ynez Valley, and they're always like taken aback, and they say,
Huh.
"What an incredible change." And I'm like, not really.
Yeah.
I used to listen to medicated people for a living, and I still listen to medicated people for a living. So that's my disarming line,
Yeah.
because it can really change the nature of the conversation when you bring up
Yeah.
hospice for people, especially if an older crowd
Yeah.
that have lost parents and whatnot. It totally changes the
Yeah.
conversation, which isn't always
Yeah.
ideal in that setting. And so yeah, and so that's the line I use. But I really think, for me, like the process of coming into the wine industry and coming into the San Ynez Valley, for me, it was about becoming more and more human, I think. Like, and I didn't necessarily have the language for that. I was just trying to find a job, trying to figure out what in the world
Yeah.
came next, where it felt like home, to try to find a sense of place. But but there's something about being here and kind of getting your hands dirty. I lived in such a cerebral
Mm,
context back
mm,
then. I was always the big idea guy. I was always
yeah,
kind of proud to be in my ivory tower, never
yeah,
coming
yeah,
down. And here, like, there's just something so human about plunging your hands into the dirt, right? And
yeah,
being
yeah, yeah,
around farmers, and I've helped out in pruning vines and in harvesting and in making wine, and there's just something so very human and even so very spiritual about knowing what's underneath your feet, and getting your hands dirty, and so that's
yeah.
why it felt to me like this wasn't a regression. This was about me kind of coming out of the ivory tower and learning what was underneath my feet, and being around people who could talk about the dirt underneath our feet, and who like
Mm,
getting their hands and their clothes
yeah,
dirty.
yeah, yeah. I love that. Becoming more human, which I think a lot of pastors, ministry leaders can resonate with. I certainly do. Um, an embrace, almost. We need to embrace our humanity, and rather than the role that we feel like we need to fill, and there's freedom in that, in my experience. Side note, well, kind of side note. So it's so interesting, Christmas Eve services are always like, at least in my life in the past, have always been very like stressful. Oh, Christmas
Yeah,
Eve, got to do Christmas Eve. And
yeah,
it's so interesting after my getting kicked out of ministry and then kind of tiptoeing back in, it's a totally different experience. Like, I came home from the Christmas Eve service. My family had already gotten home, and my wife was like, "Are you exhausted?" I'm like, "Yeah, it it doesn't stress me out the way it used to." And I think because I'm like, I'm just me, I'm just doing my thing. They're just there. They're people, as
yeah,
opposed to this, oh, Christmas Eve, we got to make all this stuff happen on Christmas Eve, and but that there's anyway, that's what comes to mind when I think about finding my humanity, kind of the
yeah,
way that you're describing, right?
yeah,
Um, I think one of the challenges that a lot of pastors and ministry leaders have right now is kind of leading in a world that is different from what they anticipated, and having to do ministry in ways that they hadn't anticipated. And so I think right, one of the challenges for leaders is just coming to grips with a disappointment, right? That what they have to do, what they're being asked to do or called to do, is just not what they had expected. Um, and so when pastors are leading change, or leading through challenges, that requires them to ask, okay, if this is really their work to do, or is it someone else's, right? And so, in other words, if it's not my work, can I let go of it, right? Or if it's not my work, what does that say about me? Um, uh, do I have to be the one to do all these things that will make my church successful, or whatever, effective, or have an impact, or whatever it might be? So anyway, okay, so um, so when I think about you kind of learned through almost. I mean, a lot of times it gets thrust upon us, right? The realization, the clarification gets thrust upon us. But you kind of went through this experience. You got clarity as to who you are, and and what maybe in a sense what really matters. So I guess my question here, maybe as we close, is just sort of what encouragement would you give to those pastors who are like, I don't know how to lead in this space. I don't know who I am without it. I don't know if I need to let go. For me, part of when I got voted out, it kind of shattered a dream of, oh, I'm going to be at this church until I retire. I'm going to be one of those pastors. And I had to let go of that. What would you say to those who are maybe having a hard time, maybe
yeah,
letting go?
yeah. Yeah, I thought I was going to be a college pastor for my entire life.
Hmm.
And I don't. I guess all I can really kind of talk about is my own experience with it. For one thing, it just took me years. It took. I just think
Hmm.
you have to be patient with yourself. You have to be patient with
Hmm.
the process. And one of the one of the books that's been most formative for me is a book called Transitions by a guy named William Bridges, who wrote this back
Hmm.
in the 70s or 80s. And I always have to acknowledge this: the guy that wrote the most important book on transitions, his last name is Bridges. You're like, what are the
Yeah,
odds?
right.
I always have to
That's
acknowledge
funny.
that. But he differentiated between change and transition, and that has continued to
Hmm.
be so important for me. The change are the external things that that often are thrust upon you. I'm completely relating to what you're saying, where it just feels like change just
Yeah.
happens, especially now. It just feels like it
Yeah.
just happens, and the only constant is change, and things are thrust upon
Hmm.
you, circumstances happen, people happen, and so that's one thing. But then the transition is the internal process. And so often we leap from one thing to the next. We make that external change before we actually
Hmm.
kind of acknowledge the end of what's come before. And so what Bridges says is you can't
Hmm.
actually have a true transition until you acknowledge the ending of what has come before. And
Hmm.
again, that gets back to the grief idea that you have to
Yeah.
acknowledge someone has died, something has changed, my identity has
Hmm.
died, and I'm trying
Yeah.
to find a new identity.
Yeah.
But it's a slow process, but it is something that has to happen internally, I think. If we let change just sort of toss us around, like our sense of identity toss it around, it's going to be a very confusing and tumultuous process. And so
Yeah.
for me, it took me many years, 3, 4 years, to finally truly acknowledge the end of my ministry, my time as
Hmm.
Reverend McHugh, and to truly step into my new role, but also the world and the community in
Yeah.
which I was living in.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. Patience, right? It is a long, slow process. Leading churches is a long, slow process, and transformation, our own transformation, and becoming, right? Our becoming whatever it is that God is in the process of shaping us into. Not that we're not what we're meant to be right now, but we're always being shaped. And so, anyway, I love that the patience. Um, Adam, if anybody, so first of all, thank you for sharing your story with us, and thank you
My
for these
pleasure.
really helpful insights. If people wanted to find out more about you and your work or your book, where could they go?
I don't really have a website anymore. You can find a few different links on the interwebs. The book's called "Blood from a Stone: A Memoir of How Wine Brought Me Back from the Dead." You can find it in all the places you would expect online, or you can order it through any local bookstore. I'm a big fan of shopping for local books
Yeah,
in local bookstores. You can find me on Instagram, Adam McHugh Wine, or you can just email me, adammchugh@gmail.com, or you can find my bio on Amazon and the InterVarsity
yeah,
Press website, which will give you a link and will help you contact me.
awesome, awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here, and thanks for just again for sharing your story with us.
My pleasure. I really enjoyed it.
All right, we got it. That was great.
Was
That
it
was
good?
great. Yeah, I loved it.
Good questions, dude. You asked some really. I was a little bit scared. I was afraid
Oh,
I was going to get a lot of Bolsinger like leadership development
uh
questions, and I
huh.
was just like, oh god, I don't have that anymore in
Oh,
my repertoire. So
yeah, no, that's okay. I only read one part from his letter that I kind of
it was
referred to
really
it, but I kind of hear the end there. Yeah,
long.
yeah. But yeah, no, but the thing is, right? Okay, if we're talking adaptive leadership, and that's what Todd likes to focus on, um, spiritual formation is a huge part of that, right? You
Totally.
can't be a healthy adaptive leader if you don't have a healthy inner life, right?
Right.
And so your story addresses that very important part of adaptive leadership. There's the techniques, but then there's also the formation, right? And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
this is definitely the formation part of it, I think. Yeah.
Totally. Totally.
Yeah. So
Cool.
anyway, thank you. That was
Yeah. Thank
great.
you.